Thank you all for giving us a very rich background for the conversation. I just want to ask two questions to start off, and then we'll open it up. My first question is to Professor Allen. I thought you made the most striking statement in the whole program so far when you said that use of the trust funds, you thought, could in fact stretch out the date of any default requirement, and I think you said for weeks, even months, even to the next election, which is a year from now. That's actually a rather stunning thought. That was certainly not part of the general conversation in the run-up to a week ago. It could affect the run-up to 3 months from now if that became a widespread view. So elaborate a little bit. Tell us if you think that is really the case, and I would invite the other panelists to chime in as well.
So my understanding from the essays that Professor McConnell and Professor Jackson did is that they both say that there is legal authority to use the trust funds to liquidate securities and make payments on Social Security. Now that's not 100%. There's some doubt about that. But the second issue then is how much of a deficit are we running? And one of the things that's happened, of course, is because we've had a big increase in tax payments, the deficit's gone down significantly. And all of those things mean that it becomes much easier to do these kinds of machinations whereby you're stretching out, because you get to a certain point, you're basically not really having to do that much at all in terms of delaying payments. And Anna and I were just talking about this before we came down. And one view is that actually it wouldn't be that difficult to go some time. Whether we could go a year or not, who knows? But and I take Dave Stockton's point that it could be pretty bad. So there will be a lot of political pressure. But on the other hand, I think the Obama administration's strategy of not negotiating must have been based on some sort of notion that they could actually go through the debt ceiling and continue for some time. And so that's why I think it's an interesting possibility.
Anna, you want to tell us if that's all legal?
Oh, sure. So this was done in 1985. Right. So at a minimum, what we know is that this was done by Secretary Baker in 1985, and that there was some effort later to legislate a prohibition on withdrawals from the Social Security Trust Fund, and that bill did not pass. And there is a Comptroller General, opinion on this. So it's far from crazy. It's perfectly sensible. And then you have to look at the flows, and we've gone from a situation where debt was something like 40% of the monthly payments to I think we're in the 20s now. So if we went down to 10%, then we could just take care of it with Social Security. But I mean, you are raiding the Social Security Trust Fund, so it's hardly attractive.
But there's really no Social Security Trust Fund, is there?
It's just a bunch of pieces of paper in a file cabinet. Is that the reference?
Yeah.
Yes.
Anybody else on this?
Well, if this is true, that certainly is helpful. But here's why I'm still not totally comforted by the prospect of what would happen if, in fact, we hit the debt limit, and even if we didn't default immediately. I still think the initial effect of this would be a shock with some significant negative feedback on the economy, even if it was just from the uncertainty and confidence effects. As that happens, your revenues are going to start dropping rather significantly. And given that you're, in essence, now the good news of how the deficits declined is going to be working in reverse, and I think you're going to be under more pressure than you might think that first year, even if you could pay the Social Security recipients with the trust funds. So I'm happy to hear this, and I didn't know that, but I'm not totally calmed by it.
Angel, market reactions, if they do this in January or February, what's the market reaction to this kind of response?
I think I wouldn't recommend it. I can see different ways in which the market would react, but when the issuer starts selling its own things. I don't think others want to hold that. And I would take that very seriously. So this would be a solution that maybe buys them a month or two, but essentially I don't think it would increase the confidence in the system. If anything, it would decrease it, and it could create a sentiment in which you can imagine that other holders, especially foreign, are also going to start selling those treasuries.
Bill Klein has a two-hander.
You know, an economist would set the debt ceiling at net debt. That's 11 trillion. The legal debt ceiling includes the holdings by Social Security and Medicare, et cetera, and that puts it all the way up. So, you know, if you start down this road, you know, you've got maybe 4 trillion that you could just run down the holdings of your government debt by these trust funds. You know, that's 30% of GDP. You can go for 10 years. I mean, I think this idea needs to be explored, you know, and it's basically, there's a much smaller idiosyncrasy. Again, it's a net versus gross misunderstanding. We're increasing our debt by $100 billion a year because of our student loan programs without taking any credit for the fact that we're increasing our assets by $100 billion a year correspondingly. Now, I think there may be some incredibly ripe possibility here to shift the net, to make the gross debt figure approximate the net debt figure and that, I mean, could be quite a remarkably powerful possibility. It's also possible that I've misunderstood what you say because this is so potentially powerful.
Okay, anybody gonna come back on that? Sure.
Quick, just as a technical matter, this is not an option available for all debt held by the U.S. government. This is quite particular to some funds, to the extent it's available. And just because it's available, of course, doesn't make it remotely a good idea.
Okay, let me open up to the floor and see what questions you have. Mark, please go to the mic and identify yourself and fire away.
Thank you. Mark Finley with BP. And I'd like to thank you and the panelists for putting this topical session together. I guess my question primarily is for Angel, but I'd welcome all the thoughts from the panel. It's not just pricing U.S. Treasuries that becomes an issue if U.S. Treasuries are not perceived as risk-free. All of modern finance is premised on pricing all assets on risk-free assets. So my question is, if there's no risk-free asset, how does anything get priced? I mean, is that just an academic question, or are there real practical ramifications of that?
Angel?
Absolutely. You are absolutely correct. Then you create a very serious problem. And the experience we have seen in the euro area is that basically financial markets become dislodged. I mean, you lose the anchor. And then it is very difficult to price comparable securities across countries and all that. So it is not academic. It is very fundamental. In the case of U.S. Treasuries, I think it would be even worse because it is the risk-free asset in the world, right? I mean, it's a problem if Spain loses that condition for a while. I think it's a different problem if the U.S. does.
Angel, suppose this did happen here. Would German bunds, for example, then become viewed as the closest thing to a risk-free asset and become the new benchmark? And would that be an adequate substitute in the markets or answer to Mark's question?
It could, but the volume is just different. I mean, the volume of bonds is you know, a fraction of the volume of U.S. Treasuries. So I think the global financial system would have a major problem if U.S. Treasuries were to become suspect.
Sherman?
Sherman Robinson. The debate on the legal issues kind of drives home, I think, a lesson we should learn. Never ask a lawyer whether something is legal. Tell a lawyer what you want to do and ask him how to make it legal. In this case, I kind of like the 14th Amendment, but I think it's easier to use a statutory argument. The president announces that he's got a problem, argues that the tax law and expenditure law effectively amends the debt limit law and then says, I'm going to instruct the Secretary of Treasury to sell bonds. Then what? You could impeach him. House could do that. I'd love to see the argument we're going to impeach the president because he saved the global economy. You could also then sue him, but it's not at all obvious that anyone would have standing to sue. There's no damage. I'd like to hear that.
Okay, answers, Anna?
Look, that's why I'm not quite siding with Professor McConnell saying this is flat out unconstitutional. I think there's some fabulous arguments why it would be. And I think all those arguments run into the basic question. The way you do this is you hold an auction. Assuming everybody shows up and buys at some acceptable discount, then what happens to all the markets that Angel and colleagues have been talking about, right? And so it's by no means clear to me that by being clever, we're actually saving the world's economy. And when you have an absolute free pass, frankly, for 45 days with the Impoundment Control Act, and that's assuming no Social Security, right? So, one of them buys, one option buys you time if you think that's what you need. The other option brings forward a confrontation. If you think the uncertainty is acceptable, that's fine. But it's not a legal question. It's a question of what's your view of the world. I mean, you may well win in the end. At what cost?
Again, let me ask the rest of the panel, Professor Allen, Angel, maybe all three of you. Suppose Obama bonds are issued, as Anna called them. Is this a Class B security? Does a Class B Treasury? Does it differ? Different yields, different liquidity features? How different would this be? And would that make a big difference? Who wants to?
I'll
Professor
start.
Allen?
So, what Professor McConnell argues in his piece is that it wouldn't have the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, and therefore it would be a Class B bond, and people would be reluctant to buy it. And that's a legal issue. I think it would be there would certainly be great uncertainty about this, and that might lead to a significant discount. Let me just mention some other points. There are a lot of technical issues that you could, or technical ways you can get around this. So one of the ones that gets repeated in the press quite often is that the Treasury could mint a $1 trillion platinum coin because coins aren't subject to the debt limit. Another very interesting one, which I'd only heard recently, which was I was reminded of by the statutes that Anna put up. The debt limit is according to par. So if you pay very high rates of interest on bonds, they're going to sell for way above par. And so the government can actually raise a lot more money by selling those kinds of bonds and get around the debt limit that way. So there are many ways to do it which don't require these kinds of things. But the government said they're not going to do that, and hopefully we won't come to that. But there are other ways, other than Obama bonds, as they're called, of doing these things.
Mike, a two-hander, and then to Lee.
Mike Prell, independent consultant. I'm curious about the Federal Reserve in this story that we've just been talking about. One presumption was that the Fed could buy defaulted debt. And I think the Federal Reserve Act is sort of silent on this, and so maybe silence means okay. But Anna, you indicated that these Obama bonds might be ultimately assumed by the government, and the comment was just made about whether these are full faith and credit. So I'm wondering whether another presumption that seemed to be present in the market should be questioned, which was that the Federal Reserve could participate in that market, either purchasing or doing repurchase agreements with these so-called Obama bonds.
Go ahead.
So just as a practical matter, is there any way the Treasury would issue anything through the debt ceiling without having figured this out with the Fed? Right? So it's all going to be part of the same legal and market risk assessment. I mean, that's sort of my totally pragmatic view. The very most straightforward, simplistic reading of all the language together is that debt that's not authorized by the Congress is questionable. There are, as I said, brilliant arguments that say why the question should be resolved in favor of breaking through the debt ceiling. The question is how much time you want to spend on the question.
How about figuring it out with the People's Bank of China? They're the second largest creditor, and I could imagine working out some understandings with them on how the Obama bonds were backed up. Back in my days at Treasury a long time ago, we sold Carter bonds to the Bundesbank, the Swiss National Bank. Those were denominated in foreign currency. They were off-market. They were done with special bilateral agreements with those central banks. To our intention, and I think it worked out that way, they didn't have much, if any, effect on the private markets. So you kind of lined up, our purpose, of course, was the exchange rate, not funding the debt. But if your purpose was funding the debt, why couldn't you talk to some big creditors? Unfortunately, you'd be blessing their continuing to accumulate dollars, which means intervening to keep their currency weak. They don't care for that too much. But maybe if the payoff was to keep financing the debt without having to go these other ways, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. What about negotiating with the foreign creditors? Any views on that?
We have a political view that picturing President Obama going to the People's Republic of China to get around the United States Congress could present certain problems of appearance that might make that difficult to actually implement.
Maybe it might suggest to the Congress that they ought to act.
But I think many of the things that we're talking about here are all about very significant second best. So what would you do in these circumstances? Nothing, or something that might be questionable or questionable legally, have certain uncertain economic effects. I mean, I think that's sort of you'd have to put that in some sort of game theoretic model to try to understand, would the administration want to try to force the Congress to quickly back off by just doing nothing, or would it want to send some appearance that it had a plan, it actually could get around things, but then risk extending this period of turmoil even longer? So I'm not sure how that works out, because I'm not a political scientist, but I could see lots of difficulties there.
Lee?
I have a comment and a question. So the comment is that, to me, a lot of this is a political debate here. I mean, the Congress is trying to wrest power, or at least the House, power from the president and get certain concessions from it. And to either go to China or do the Social Security thing will have its own political repercussions, and one of the game theoretic issues is what kind of leverage does Obama lose relative to the House if he does that, or he goes to China? I mean, those have real political implications for the next battle they go to. But to go to the question, if the president says he sees the conflict, the arithmetic problem, and to get around that he's going to issue more debt, I'm not sure why he would issue Obama bonds as opposed to more bonds and make them all fungible with each other. Why would he want to identify something, as long as he's breaking through whatever the Congress had said is the debt limit? Why? I don't understand why it would be in his advantage not to just issue 4-week bills and 1-year treasuries and make them all fungible. It's not in his interest to make them separate.
Absolutely, and I didn't make myself clear. It is not that he would want to issue Obama bonds. It is that by definition, the bonds that are issued without the authority of the Congress are allegedly, that's what the challenge is going to be. That's what the request for a declaratory judgment is going to be.
Will they be identifiable after 3 weeks?
Well, on how you tell me. I mean, they have their CUSIPs, right? I mean,
They have their numbers, right?
But if you look at the debt level, it goes up and above it. It goes up and down on a daily basis. It doesn't go up every day.
No, but
that's precisely the point.
What I think Anna is trying to say.
CUSIP of which of those bonds was above and which was below is not.
Well,
sure.
either you open a new bond or you reopen one, but it would be clear to people buying them which one. I mean, they have a unique identification, right?
Surely they do.
So they would become off the run immediately,
Which ones-
and they would
which ones
trade
were
at a
issued
discount.
the day you were above, and which ones were, and if you were just below when you issued them, which half of the ones that you issued that day were above and below? I think they can make them
Fine.
very hard to find.
That's precisely the point. Right? Is that the conversation you want to be having?
Yes.
And I think if that's the conversation you want to be having, if you think that we can handle that conversation, I think we're on much safer ground. And
No, it's clearly not a conversation you want to have. It's-
Well, this is all in the realm of second, third, nth best, so we know
The
that.
best hope would be, I would think, that they didn't win very much this time. They did back down. Well, Boehner allowed a vote that only got 85 Republican votes, and will he, having seen that and being willing to do that, has Obama won this, at least for this Congress in February? And that's, I think, the real question is what happens in February, March, when we go through it again.
Okay, next question, young lady here, and then a couple more.
Heather Ross, Resources for the Future. The Tea Party is the in-house shock troops of the Republican Party, and so they're allowed to run with their action because they're doing things that the party hopes to achieve in terms of policy. My question is, are the magnitudes of what you're talking about, the costs of doing this brinkmanship, so high that it will cause the party and the money in the party to reconsider and put a stake through the heart of its hard-right people, because of course it could?
Well, I think we're all saying that the range of items discussed here are decidedly inferior to a fundamental solution to the underlying fiscal issues, and so the answer would have to be yes. Whatever was necessary politically to get to that proper outcome, I think all of us would be for it. Yes, ma'am.
So, hi, Wendy Edelberg from CBO. I think I have a question for Angel. So, I've struggled with how to interpret CDS spreads and what signal to take from them. Do we know how much money would change hands if there was a default? And do we know who's on the other side of these contracts?
The answer is I don't know, and it's not obvious what happens if. First of all, we need to know who's selling you the CDS, because if there were to this were to happen, whether that institution would still be able to pay you. But I think what I was trying to show is the direction of the move, and I think that matters. I think that signals something at the beginning, and we can discuss whether it's meaningful or not.
I mean, so certainly up is bad and down is better, but like, I don't know who these people are who are, well, I frankly don't know who's on either side of the contract. Like,
I don't know either. I can imagine that the person buying the insurance is somebody who's holding a lot of treasury bills, and the sellers is a dealer. But I don't think we can know. All I'm trying to say is that I agree with you that the concept of a CDS on US treasuries is an amorphous one because of the circularity here. But I think the move, the direction of the move that is consistent with some of the other things I was showing is telling you something. That is, people got a little bit worried. And I think it's important to know that.
There was
So
another hand
if,
down
I,
here, Doug.
if I could just say one thing there. So we do have a chapter in the book where these questions are addressed. So Richard Squire from Fordham University wrote chapter 7, which is a market for the end of world insurance, credit default swaps on US government debt, where a lot of these issues were pondered.
And the net volume is much smaller than everybody else, for what it's worth.
Doug.
Doug Hamilton with the Peterson Foundation. I have a two-part question. The first is, as you look forward over the next several months, how do you think this is all going to play out? Are we going to have another confrontation with the debt ceiling or not? And second, what would be the impact on financial markets and the economy if the debt ceiling were completely taken off the table with the adoption of something like the McConnell rule?
Who wants to brave that one?
So I guess I don't do economic forecasting that well, and so I can't imagine I'll do political forecasting any better. But my sense would be that we're not likely to have another imminent repeat of the sort of debt ceiling brinksmanship that we had this time around, because it proved to be so unproductive and so unrewarding for those parties that were actually pursuing it. So I think we've reduced there. I think on the budget itself, we are either going to be somewhere between remaining at the full sequestration levels, or perhaps easing up a bit on the sequestration levels and allowing some reallocation across the various categories of the budget to in the interest of both parties, perhaps, to do that. So no major change on the fiscal policy front. If the debt ceiling were completely removed, I think there'll be a small positive for financial market developments and some easing of concern about the conduct of fiscal policy in the United States. As I indicated, sort of the cumulative effects of that, the way that we've been managing fiscal policy, have been negative, and I think that would ease up on some of those negative effects.
I fully agree, yes, for the record.
One more question in the back.
Robin Harding from the Financial Times. It's a two-part question. First, on the debt ceiling, is it actually possible constitutionally to get rid of the debt ceiling completely, given that the Constitution gives Congress the power to borrow? And then second, just to follow up on Mike Prell's question, I'd be very interested in what Dave Stockton had to say about what the Fed's attitude would actually be in this post-debt ceiling world. What would the Fed be trying to do? Would it just be trying to ease financial market conditions, or would it be looking to do something more expansive, do you think? Thank you.
Anna, you want to do the first one?
Yes. I mean, they just suspended it until February 7th, clean. So no number until February 7th. So absolutely. If they wanted to, they could give the president authority to borrow with no ceiling, maybe with other conditions, but it's theirs to give up.
I think the Fed would be in an exceedingly difficult position in a post-debt ceiling world. I would love to be able to pretend that whatever it was doing at the direction of the Treasury and as the Treasury's fiscal agent. As a practical matter, in terms of actually responding by, let's say, expanding significantly quantitative easing, there would be enormous tensions within the committee about whether or not that was appropriate and the extent to which and I think the Fed's credibility, and political independence, which have become under greater threat in recent years, would be put under much greater pressure. And I think it would be difficult to know exactly where they'd come out, but they would not be happy about being put in this position.
Back to the analogy with Europe, would that then make the Fed more like the ECB? And I raise it because the ECB has basically functioned as the government of Europe in this crisis. There was no government of Europe, and so the ECB had to play the role of the government at many stages in providing financial resources to avoid the crisis. If the U.S. government essentially was rendered impotent by imposition of the debt ceiling, would the Fed then have to be the government of the United States for those purposes, at least for that time period?
So the Fed would then be put in a position of trying to adjudicate between two political poles in the United States. This, I think, would be a very, it won't be seen. Sometimes the political body politic wants the Fed to act because the body politic doesn't want to take a difficult decision. I'm not sure in this case that is how the Fed's actions would be viewed, if it was viewed as supporting an ability to reduce the pressure on the administration to take the direction that some members of Congress might want it to take. So you're right. It moves the Fed in that direction of making it even more political in that sense. But I think the circumstances would be much more contentious politically than even they've been for the ECB.
Well, it's clear that everybody would be distinctly uncomfortable in that situation, and so we'll hope it doesn't happen. But hopefully today's discussion shed a bit of light on what could happen and at least some possible alternatives. We thank our speakers enormously for both initiating the idea, for speaking so eloquently and articulately on the points. So Anna, Frank, Dave, Angel, thank you all very much. Thanks to all of you for attending. Meeting adjourned.